The wind howled through the dense forest, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. Ethan Walker adjusted the strap of his backpack and pushed forward, his boots crunching against the fallen leaves. He had spent years living in these woods, far away from the noise of civilization. Out here, he was free. No crowds, no chaos, just nature and the peace it offered. But today felt different. There was something strange in the air, a feeling, a tension. Ethan had learned to trust his instincts, and right now, they were screaming at him to stay alert. His hand moved to the hunting knife on his belt as he scanned the trees. Then he heard it, something faint but unmistakable. A whimper. Ethan frowned and turned toward the sound. It was weak, almost lost in the wind, but it was there. Someone was out here, injured. He moved quickly, stepping over roots and rocks, his sharp eyes scanning the area. The sound grew louder as he neared a small clearing. Then he saw her. At first, Ethan thought it was a trick of the light. A person. No, something more, was slumped against a tree, half covered in leaves. She was humanoid, but not human. Her skin shimmered faintly in the dim light, a strange silver-blue color. Her long hair, dark as midnight, clung to her face. She was breathing, but only just. Ethan took a cautious step forward. His military training told him to be careful. She could be dangerous. But one look at her told him she was in no condition to fight. Blood, her blood, stained the ground beneath her. It wasn't red. It was a deep violet, almost glowing. She was hurt, badly. Ethan knelt beside her, his fingers hovering over her shoulder. "Hey," he said softly. No response. He touched her arm gently, and she flinched, her eyes fluttering open. And what eyes they were! They glowed a soft violet, filled with pain and confusion. She stared at him, trying to focus. Her lips parted as if she wanted to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she winced and tried to move, but her body failed her. "Easy," Ethan said, raising a hand to show he meant no harm. "You're hurt. Don't move." The girl, alien girl, blinked at him, her expression unreadable. Then, with great effort, she whispered something in a language he didn't understand. It was soft and musical, but completely foreign. Ethan shook his head. "I don't understand," he admitted. She frowned slightly, frustration flickering in her glowing eyes. Then her gaze dropped to her side, where a deep gash ran along her ribs. She let out a pained breath, her body trembling. Ethan didn't hesitate. Whoever she was, whatever she was, she needed help. He reached into his backpack, pulling out a first aid kit. "All right, this might hurt, but I need to stop the bleeding." She tensed as he carefully lifted her torn clothing away from the wound. The cut was deep, too deep. She must have been bleeding for hours. How was she still alive? Was her species just that strong? As gently as he could, Ethan cleaned the wound, applying pressure to slow the bleeding. The alien girl gasped, her body shuddering from the pain, but she didn't resist. If anything, she was watching him, studying his face. When he finished wrapping the wound, Ethan met her gaze. "That's the best I can do for now," he said. "You need rest." She didn't respond, but her glowing eyes softened slightly, as if she understood. Then, exhaustion overtook her, and she slipped into unconsciousness. Ethan exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. What had he just gotten himself into? He had spent years in these woods, surviving alone. But this was something else entirely. An alien. A real, living alien, wounded and alone in the middle of nowhere. Who was she? Where had she come from? And why was she running? Ethan looked down at her, at the slow rise and fall of her chest. One thing was clear. Someone had tried to kill her. And if they were still looking for her, he glanced at the darkening forest. They might come here next. Ethan sighed and adjusted his backpack. "Well," he muttered to himself, "looks like I'm not alone anymore." With that, he carefully lifted the alien girl into his arms. She was surprisingly light, her body delicate despite whatever strength she might have. She stirred slightly, her fingers weakly gripping his shirt. Ethan hesitated for only a second before he tightened his hold on her. Then, with steady steps, he carried her toward his cabin, away from the dangers of the wild. He had no idea who she was or what trouble she brought with her, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let her die here. Not on his watch. Ethan pushed the cabin door open with his shoulder, careful not to jostle the unconscious alien girl in his arms. His cabin was small but sturdy, built for survival. A fireplace crackled in the corner, casting a warm glow over the wooden walls. A simple bed sat against the far wall, and he carried her to it, lowering her gently onto the mattress. She stirred, her silver-blue skin catching the firelight. She was still too weak to move, but her breathing was steady. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, watching her carefully. He had encountered dangerous creatures before, but none like her. She wasn't just some lost animal in the woods. She was someone, and someone had tried to kill her. Ethan sighed and rubbed his temples. He had no idea where she had come from or why she was here. But one thing was clear: she needed help. He couldn't just leave her to die. He grabbed a damp cloth from a bucket of clean water and gently wiped the dirt and dried blood from her face. She flinched slightly but didn't wake up. Up close, she looked even more delicate, her glowing violet eyes hidden behind her closed eyelids. What was she? Her body seemed human in shape, but the silver hue of her skin, the faint glow of her veins, and the strange ridges along her arms told him she was something completely different. He had seen a lot of strange things in his life, but an alien princess bleeding out in his cabin, that was a first. A soft groan escaped her lips. Ethan tensed, watching as her eyes fluttered open. For a moment, she looked lost, confused. Then, her gaze locked onto him. She gasped and jerked away, trying to sit up, but pain shot through her body, and she collapsed back onto the bed with a sharp breath. "Hey, easy," Ethan said, raising his hands to show he wasn't a threat. "You're hurt. Don't move too much." Her chest rose and fell quickly as she stared at him. Her glowing violet eyes darted around the room, then back to him. She parted her lips, trying to speak, but the words came out in a language he didn't understand. Soft, melodic, and completely foreign. Ethan shook his head. "I don't understand you." She frowned slightly, frustration flashing across her face. She tried again, but the words were meaningless to him. Ethan thought for a moment. Communication was key. He pointed to himself. "Ethan." She watched him, then hesitated before pointing weakly to herself. "Lyra." Ethan gave a small nod. Lyra. At least now he had a name. He reached for the bowl of water and held up the damp cloth. "I need to clean your wound," he said slowly, hoping she would understand. Lyra eyed the cloth, then his face. She seemed unsure, but after a moment, she gave a small, hesitant nod. Ethan worked carefully, dabbing at the wound on her ribs. She winced, but didn't resist. He could feel her eyes watching him the entire time. There was a deep intelligence behind them, something more than just fear or pain. She was studying him, just as he was studying her. As he worked, he spoke softly, not expecting her to understand, but hoping his tone would keep her calm. "I don't know where you came from, but you're lucky I found you. Someone did a number on you out there." Lyra said something in her language, but this time, her voice was weaker, almost sad. Ethan glanced up and met her eyes. She was running from something. "Who did this to you?" he asked. He knew she wouldn't understand, but he had to try. Lyra swallowed and looked away. Then, slowly, she lifted a trembling hand and pointed toward the door. Ethan frowned. "Out there." She nodded weakly. That wasn't good. If she had enemies out there, then that meant he wasn't alone in these woods anymore. Someone, or something, was hunting her. And if they tracked her here, Ethan clenched his jaw. They would find him too. He finished cleaning her wound and set the cloth aside. Then he grabbed a fresh blanket and draped it over her. She was still shivering, her body clearly weak from blood loss. "You need rest," he said firmly. Lyra's gaze softened slightly. She stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to figure him out. Then, to his surprise, she whispered something so softly he almost didn't hear it. "Thank you." Ethan's eyes widened slightly. It wasn't perfect, but it was clear she had understood at least some of what he was saying. A small, tired smile touched her lips before her eyelids drooped shut, and she drifted back into sleep. Ethan sat back, exhaling slowly. He had spent years alone in these woods, surviving by himself. But now, everything had changed. Lyra wasn't just some lost traveler. She was a target. And if the people hunting her came looking, they were going to have a problem. Ethan sat by the fireplace, his rifle resting against the wall. The crackling flames filled the quiet cabin with warmth, but his mind was far from calm. His eyes flicked toward the bed where Lyra lay, her silver-blue skin almost glowing in the dim light. She was still asleep, her breathing steady but weak. He had done what he could for her injuries, but she needed more than just bandages and rest. She needed medicine, food, and most importantly, safety. And that was the real problem. She wasn't safe. Ethan glanced at the wooden door, his instincts on high alert. Lyra had pointed toward the woods earlier, a silent warning that whoever had hurt her was still out there. And they might be coming for her. Something in the dark. The night stretched on, silent except for the occasional howl of the wind. Ethan's grip tightened around his hunting knife. He had spent years surviving in these woods. But tonight, something felt different. The usual sounds of the forest were missing. No owls, no rustling leaves, just an unnatural stillness. Something was out there. A soft groan came from the bed. Ethan turned and saw Lyra shifting slightly, her violet eyes fluttering open. She blinked, confused for a moment, then tensed. Ethan followed her gaze toward the window. A shadow moved outside. The first attack. Ethan's muscles went rigid. He moved quickly, grabbing his rifle and signaling Lyra to stay down. Her breathing quickened, and he could see the fear in her glowing eyes. Then, a sharp sound. A twig snapped outside. Ethan slowly approached the door, his grip firm on the rifle. His heart pounded, but his mind was steady. He had fought before. He had survived worse. But this was different, because this wasn't just about him. He had someone to protect. The door rattled slightly as if something was testing it. Then, silence. Ethan held his breath. Then, BM. The door burst open, and a dark figure lunged inside. Ethan didn't hesitate. He fired. The gunshot echoed through the cabin, and the figure staggered back, a strange, inhuman snarl escaping its throat. Ethan barely had time to register what it was. Tall, armored, with reptilian features and glowing yellow eyes. Before it rushed at him again, Ethan rolled to the side, grabbing his hunting knife just as the creature swiped at him with razor-sharp claws. He ducked, driving the blade into its side. The creature let out a pained hiss but didn't fall. Lyra gasped from the bed, her body weak but her eyes wide with fear. Ethan gritted his teeth. He had to end this. Fast. Using his military reflexes, he spun and slammed the butt of his rifle against the creature's head. It staggered, giving him the opening he needed. With one final powerful strike, he drove his knife into its neck. The creature let out a choked gurgle before collapsing to the floor. Ethan stood over it, his breathing heavy. His hands were steady, but his mind was racing. This thing, this alien hunter, had been tracking Lyra. And if there was one, there were more. Lyra's truth. Ethan turned to Lyra, who was struggling to sit up despite her injuries. "What the hell was that?" he asked, wiping blood from his knife. Lyra's lips trembled as she tried to speak. Her voice was weak, but her words were clear enough. "Hunters," she whispered. They find me. Ethan narrowed his eyes. Why? Who are they? Lyra swallowed hard. They want me dead. Ethan clenched his fists. He had suspected as much, but hearing it from her made it real. Someone had sent killers after her, and that meant they weren't going to stop. Lyra looked at him with pleading eyes. Not safe. You? Not safe. Ethan met her gaze, his expression unreadable. He should have been scared. He should have been thinking of a way to get out of this mess. But instead, he just nodded. Then we fight. Lyra's eyes widened. You help me. Ethan grabbed his rifle and checked the ammo. Then he looked at her with a firm, steady gaze. You're in my cabin, he said simply. That makes you my responsibility. Lyra stared at him for a long moment, then her lips parted slightly. A look of something, relief, gratitude, maybe even hope, passed over her face. She nodded weakly. Thank you, Ethan. He gave her a small smirk. Don't thank me yet. Because out in the woods, beyond the trees, more shadows were moving. And the real fight hadn't even started yet. Ethan tightened his grip on the rifle, his sharp eyes locked on the darkness outside. The first alien hunter lay dead on his cabin floor, its strange, reptilian body still oozing dark blood. But Ethan knew this wasn't over. More were coming. Lyra sat weakly on the bed, her silver-blue skin pale from blood loss. She clutched her wounded side, breathing heavily, but her glowing violet eyes were filled with fear. They not stop, she whispered. More coming. Ethan gave a short nod. I know. He grabbed extra bullets from the shelf and shoved them into his pocket. Can you fight? Lyra hesitated, then shook her head. Too weak. Ethan cursed under his breath. He couldn't expect her to fight, not in her condition. That meant he was on his own. The wind howled outside, rattling the cabin walls. The night felt heavy, filled with unseen danger. Ethan moved to the window, peering into the shadows of the forest. Then he saw them. 3. No, 4. More of those alien hunters, their glowing yellow eyes flickering in the darkness. They were moving carefully, circling the cabin like wolves preparing to strike. Ethan exhaled slowly, steadying his heartbeat. He had been in worse situations. He had survived before. And he wasn't about to let these things kill him, or Lyra. He turned to her. Stay low. If anything happens to me, run. Got it. Lyra's eyes widened. No, you help me. I help you. Ethan smirked. Fine, but don't die on me. She gave a weak nod. Then, bang! The first attack came fast. One of the hunters leaped at the window, its claws smashing through the glass. Ethan fired instantly, the bullet slamming into its chest. It shrieked and fell back, but the others weren't stopping. They were inside. One of them lunged through the broken window, its sharp teeth bared. Ethan spun, slamming the barrel of his rifle into its head before shooting point blank. The creature dropped, but another one tackled him from the side, knocking him to the ground. Ethan gritted his teeth as claws raked across his shoulder, pain burning through him. He rolled, grabbing his hunting knife and stabbing deep into its neck. The alien gurgled, then went still. Another one was coming straight for Lyra. She gasped, trying to move, but her injuries were too severe. The hunter raised its claws, ready to strike. Bang! Ethan fired again, the shot hitting the creature's leg. It stumbled, screeching in pain. That gave him just enough time to grab his knife and finish the job. Panting, Ethan turned, his muscles aching. Were there more? For a moment, silence filled the cabin. No more movement. No more glowing yellow eyes. Then, a deep, guttural growl echoed from outside. Ethan's stomach dropped. Something bigger was coming. The leader arrives. The wooden door shattered as something massive stepped inside. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. This one was different. Taller. Stronger. It had heavy armor covering its chest, and its eyes burned with intelligence. A scar ran down the side of its face, and its claws looked deadly. Lyra gasped, shrinking back. "Zoreth," she whispered. Ethan didn't like the way she said that name. The alien leader, Zoreth, glanced at the fallen hunters on the floor, then turned its gaze to Ethan. It grinned. "You fight well, human," Zoreth said, his voice deep and rough. "But you are weak. You will die." Ethan smirked, wiping blood from his chin. "Funny. I was about to say the same thing to you." Zoreth let out a low chuckle. "You protect her." He gestured to Lyra. "She is nothing. A lost exile. A coward." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "Then why are you so desperate to kill her?" Zoreth's grin faded. "She does not belong. She is a traitor. And traitors must die." Ethan glanced at Lyra, who was trembling. There was something she wasn't telling him. Something important. But now wasn't the time for questions, because Zoreth was moving. The final fight. Ethan barely had time to react before Zoreth charged. Ethan rolled to the side, firing his last bullet. It hit Zoreth's armor and barely made a dent. "Damn it," Ethan muttered. He grabbed his knife, but Zoreth was too fast. The alien's clawed hand closed around Ethan's throat and lifted him off the ground. Ethan gasped, struggling as Zoreth's grip tightened. "You are strong," Zoreth growled, "but not strong enough." Ethan's vision blurred. His hand searched for a weapon. Anything. His fingers brushed against something on his belt. A flare. With the last of his strength, Ethan pulled the pin and shoved it into Zoreth's face. FWOOSH. The flare ignited, blinding the alien leader. Zoreth howled in rage, releasing Ethan as he stumbled back, clawing at his burning eyes. Ethan hit the ground hard, coughing. His lungs burned, but he forced himself to move. He grabbed his knife, and with a final brutal effort, drove it straight into Zoreth's chest. The alien let out a strangled gasp, his massive body going stiff. His glowing eyes flickered, then dimmed. Zoreth collapsed. Dead. Ethan lay on the floor, chest rising and falling heavily. Every muscle in his body ached. Then, a small, shaking hand touched his arm. He turned to see Lyra, looking at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. "You win," she whispered. Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "Barely." Lyra hesitated, then reached up and touched his face gently. "You save me." Ethan held her gaze. There was something in her eyes, something deep. He exhaled, running a hand through his messy hair. "Yeah. And I guess I'm not done yet." Because if Zoreth had found her here, more might come, and Ethan wasn't about to let that happen. Not as long as he was still breathing. The cabin was quiet again, but the silence felt heavy. Ethan sat on the floor, his back against the wooden wall, breathing heavily. His body ached from the fight, and his shirt was torn where Zoreth's claws had nearly ripped through him. He wiped the sweat from his forehead and looked at the lifeless body of the alien leader sprawled on the wooden floor. The fight had been brutal, but he had won. Lyra sat beside him, her silver-blue skin pale and her breathing still weak. She watched him carefully, her glowing violet eyes filled with something he couldn't quite name. Gratitude, admiration, fear, he wasn't sure. "You should rest," he said, his voice rough. She shook her head slowly. "More will come." Ethan sighed, rubbing his sore shoulder. She was right. If these hunters were after her, then killing their leader wouldn't stop them forever. Sooner or later, others would come looking. And next time, they might be even stronger. He stood up, stretching his aching muscles, and walked to the window. The glass was shattered, the cold night air slipping through. Outside, the forest was quiet, as if the battle had scared away even the animals. He scanned the tree line, looking for any sign of movement. Nothing. For now, they were safe. But for how long? He turned back to Lyra. "You need to tell me the truth." She hesitated, lowering her gaze. Truth is dangerous. Ethan crossed his arms. So are the people hunting you. If I'm risking my life to protect you, I need to know why. Lyra took a slow breath. She seemed to struggle with the words, but finally, she spoke. I was part of them. The hunters. My people. She clenched her fists, looking ashamed. I was like them. Until I refused. Ethan frowned. Refused what? Her eyes filled with sadness. To kill. Ethan felt a chill run through him. He had seen her fear, her pain. She had been running, not just because they wanted to capture her, but because they wanted her dead. Because she had chosen mercy. That's why they're after you, he muttered. Because you wouldn't be like them. Lyra nodded. I ran. They found me. Hurt me. I escaped, but not far. She looked at him, her expression softening. Then, you find me. Ethan exhaled slowly. He wasn't sure what to say. This wasn't just about survival anymore. She wasn't just an alien running for her life. She was someone who had made a choice, a dangerous one. And now he was caught in the middle of it. He glanced at the bodies on the floor. If they stayed here, they were sitting ducks. He needed a plan. We can't stay, he said. If more come, I can't fight them all. Lyra's face darkened with worry. Where? Go. Ethan thought for a moment. The nearest town was miles away. He had a truck, but taking her there would be dangerous. If anyone saw her, there would be questions he couldn't answer. And if the hunters found her among humans, it could lead to something worse. His best option was his old bunker. It wasn't far from here, hidden deep in the woods. He had supplies there, weapons, enough to hold out until he figured out what to do next. We go to my bunker, he said finally. It's safe. We can plan our next move there. Lyra nodded, but he could see the exhaustion in her face. She was still weak, and moving her too soon could be dangerous. You rest first, he said. We leave at dawn. She didn't argue this time. Slowly, she lay back down, her eyes fluttering closed. Within moments, she was asleep. Ethan remained awake, his rifle resting on his lap. His mind raced, thinking of what would come next. He had no idea why he was doing this. He could have walked away. He could have left her in the woods and let fate decide her fate. But he hadn't. Something about her, her courage, her kindness, her fight for something better, had made him choose differently. And now he was willing to risk everything to keep her safe. Dawn was coming, and with it, a new fight. He wasn't sure what the future held, but one thing was clear. He wasn't going to let her die. Ethan woke before the sun rose, the cold morning air slipping through the broken window. His body ached from the fight, but he ignored the pain. There was no time for weakness. They had to move before more hunters came looking for Lyra. He turned to her. She was still asleep, her silver blue skin pale, her breathing slow but steady. She looked fragile, yet there was strength in her. She had survived so much, fought against her own kind, and now she was trusting him to keep her safe. Ethan sighed and ran a hand through his hair. He wasn't sure why he cared so much. Maybe because she reminded him of himself, someone who had once walked away from war, someone who refused to be what others wanted him to be. He stood up and checked his rifle. He had a few rounds left, but not enough for another long fight. He grabbed his backpack, stuffing it with food, bandages, and whatever supplies he could find. Then he walked to Lyra's side and gently touched her shoulder. Lyra, wake up, he said softly. Her eyes fluttered open, glowing faintly in the dim light. For a moment, she looked confused. Then she remembered where she was. She slowly sat up, wincing in pain. We have to leave, Ethan said. Can you walk? Lyra nodded weakly. I try. Ethan helped her to her feet, letting her lean on him for support. She was still weak, but they had no choice. Staying here was too dangerous. Outside, the forest was silent. too silent. Ethan scanned the tree line, his grip tightening on his rifle. No movement, no sounds, but that didn't mean they weren't being watched. "We have to move fast," he said. "Stay close." Lyra nodded, and together they slipped into the trees, leaving the cabin behind. The journey was slow. Lyra struggled to walk, and Ethan had to stop several times to let her rest. He kept his senses sharp, listening for any sign of danger. The bunker wasn't far, but every step felt like a risk. After an hour of walking, they reached the river. Ethan knelt beside it, filling a canteen with fresh water. Lyra crouched beside him, dipping her hands into the cool stream. She looked up at him, her violet eyes filled with something he couldn't quite understand. "You save me," she said softly. Ethan shrugged. "Couldn't just leave you out there." She studied him for a moment. "Why?" He hesitated. He wasn't sure how to answer. Because it was the right thing to do. Because he knew what it was like to be alone. "I guess I just wanted to," he said finally. Lyra smiled slightly, but before she could say anything, a rustling sound came from the trees. Ethan froze. Something was coming. He grabbed Lyra's arm and pulled her behind a rock, raising his rifle. His heart pounded as the sound grew closer. Then, a figure stepped out of the trees. Ethan's grip tightened, but it wasn't a hunter. It was a man, dressed in old hunting gear, with a shotgun slung over his shoulder. The stranger looked just as surprised to see them. His eyes flicked to Ethan, then to Lyra. "What in the world?" the man muttered. Ethan lowered his rifle slightly, but didn't relax. "Who are you?" The man took a cautious step forward. "Name's Travis. I live up in the hills. Heard gunshots last night. Figured I'd check it out." Ethan didn't trust him, but he didn't sense immediate danger either. "You alone?" Ethan asked. Travis nodded. "Yeah, but looks like you ain't." His eyes lingered on Lyra, his expression unreadable. "You gonna tell me what's going on?" Ethan hesitated. He didn't have time for this. If Travis was a threat, he'd deal with it. If not, they had to keep moving. "Just passing through," Ethan said. Travis raised an eyebrow. "With an injured girl in the middle of the woods." Ethan clenched his jaw. "It's complicated." Travis studied him for a moment, then sighed. "Look, I don't know what's going on, but if you need a place to lay low, I got a cabin not far from here." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "Why would you help?" Travis shrugged. "You ain't the only one who knows what it's like to run from something." Ethan glanced at Lyra. She was watching Travis carefully, as if trying to decide whether to trust him. They had a choice: keep going to the bunker, or take a risk and follow this stranger. Ethan exhaled. He had always relied on himself, but maybe, just this once, trusting someone else wasn't the worst idea. He looked back at Travis and nodded. "Lead the way." Ethan followed Travis through the dense forest, keeping a firm grip on his rifle. Lyra walked beside him, still weak but determined. The stranger seemed trustworthy enough, but Ethan wasn't ready to let his guard down just yet. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a soft golden light through the trees. Birds chirped in the distance, and the cool morning air carried the scent of damp earth. It almost felt peaceful. Almost. Travis led them to a small wooden cabin hidden deep within the woods. It was old but sturdy, with a stone chimney and a stack of firewood neatly piled beside the door. "Not much," Travis said, opening the door. "But it's safe." Ethan stepped inside first, scanning the room. A fireplace, a worn-out couch, a table with a few chairs, and shelves lined with canned food. It was small but secure. Lyra sat down on the couch, exhaling tiredly. Ethan knelt beside her, checking her wound. It was healing, but slowly. She needed rest. Travis leaned against the table, watching them. "So, you gonna tell me what's really going on?" Ethan exchanged a glance with Lyra. He had avoided the truth so far, but there was no point in hiding it anymore. "She's not human," Ethan said finally. Travis didn't even flinch. He just nodded slowly. Figured as much. Ethan frowned. You're not surprised. Travis chuckled. I've been around long enough to know the world ain't as simple as people think. Seen things that don't make sense. Things no one would believe. He glanced at Lyra. What are you running from? Lyra hesitated, then spoke softly. My people. They want me dead. Travis scratched his beard. Why? She refused to kill. Ethan answered for her. She betrayed them by choosing mercy. Travis let out a low whistle. Sounds like you made some powerful enemies. Lyra looked down. They will not stop. Ethan clenched his jaw. He knew she was right. Killing Zorith had bought them time, but it wasn't over. More would come. Travis sighed and grabbed a can of beans from the shelf, tossing it to Ethan. Eat first, then we figure out what to do next. Ethan caught the can and nodded. For now, they needed food and rest. The fight wasn't over, but they weren't alone anymore. As the fire crackled in the fireplace and Lyra drifted into an exhausted sleep, Ethan stared into the flames. He had been a lone survivor for so long, never trusting anyone, never letting anyone get too close. But now, things were different. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for her, and he wasn't going to lose.